go ahead and get started. I appreciate once again seeing you all here. We are continuing our studies of the history of the church. If you were here last week, you recall I was mentioning that last week's lecture and this week are, at least for me, two of the toughest. And that's partly because the material is complex and sometimes a little hard to get your arms around, and partly because it's just not, I don't think by anybody's estimates, a great high point in the history of the ministry of the church through history. So this last week we were looking, of course, at the kind of the end of the medieval period, a really low point for the hierarchy of the Catholic Church at that time, and we all have to have some sympathy because we know that but for the grace of God go all of us in those particular paths, and so we always have to attribute to God's grace when the church is something better than what she can at least sometimes sink to. This morning may be a bit of the same. We're looking this morning at the Crusades. And obviously this represents once again one of those tragic, but at the same time, I think helpful chapters in church history in which we can learn. We can learn what works and what doesn't work, and I think we learn here what doesn't work. So we've ruled that one out. We're not going to convert the world with the sword. I think we've established that. There's got to be some other method that is going to be more effective for us. So as much as we might like to try to do that, I think we should despair of that methodology. So anyway, next week I'm happy to report to you things take a dramatic turn for the better. And really, from that point on, I think the rest of our studies you will find hopefully not only informative, but also encouraging and edifying. We're going to really be focusing from this point on people. To some degree up to this point, people have almost had to take a back seat to events, and certainly events will continue to occupy our concern. But next week we'll be looking really much more through the lens of the personalities of church history on up through the Reformation. Next week, in fact, we'll be focusing on the two probably the greatest figures of this time frame that stand out in the most dramatic sort of way as great influential thinkers. One is St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who we'll actually be mentioning briefly today, and then the other is St. Francis of Assisi. We'll try to pack both of those lives. Each would be, of course, well worth a separate discussion, but for the sake of time, we'll put them both together in one lecture. And then moving on from there to some other personalities as well, leading up to the time of the Reformation. So in any event, just hang on. We have one more kind of bumpy road today that takes us through the period of the Crusades, and then we'll be moving on to happier concerns from there. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Father, we are grateful that you have called your people to yourself, and even though through history, as we look at moments when we presumably don't see the church at her best, we know that nevertheless you are unfolding great events to your glory, and that you can cause even the wrath of man to praise you. And so we pray that as we take hopefully a frank and open and honest look at this particular chapter of the history of the church, that you would nevertheless teach us the lessons of grace that we need to learn, and that as a result of this we would be more fully disposed to worship and serve and trust you as Lord and King, asking these prayers in the name of Jesus. Amen. I've mentioned to you at other times that as we survey church history, what we see, at least one way to think about it, is a series of experiments. And we've touched on some of those. So if I could give you my suggestion for the experiment that is before us today, I'd call it the experiment in Christian militarism. Christian militarism. So this is really what's going on, and I don't know that there's any time, there's certainly been other occasions when this has been attempted, but probably never on such a grand scale as what we think of with the Crusades. There has also been, of course, the experiment in Christian pacifism. So we've had the other end of the spectrum attempted from time to time, and we'll be looking at least passingly at some of those coming from a later period. The church generally has found herself in the middle position of the just war understanding. That would go clear back to Augustine, and most of the great thinkers of the church have wound up more or less in that particular frame of reference. But nevertheless, this morning we have this Christian militarism idea that will be before us. What were the Crusades? Probably the best expression I've heard of it would be, we would conceive of these as armed pilgrimages to the Holy Land. They're armed pilgrimages. They were products of the Christian imagination at the time. While we, of course, look back on them and I think rightly have a little bit of embarrassment that the name of Christ and the credibility of the church is attached to what amounts really to nothing more than a military expedition, nevertheless, at the time, there was a kind of Christian imagination associated with it that attached to it something of a glorious possibility. The Crusades lasted for about 2 centuries. The first one was in 1095. It's toward the end of the 13th century that we have the last one kind of gasping to a conclusion, but the spirit of the Crusades lasted much longer. In fact, you may not be aware of it, but Christopher Columbus, when he was selling the idea to Isabella of financing his voyage to the East, was promising and in fact contracted with her that if he did realize some of the great gain that he was proposing was possible, that those gains could be used for yet another crusade. And that was, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, so we're 400 years after the first crusade. Still, Christian Europe is kicking around the idea of a crusade. The Crusades were unprecedented in some ways because they engaged the entire society. This wasn't simply the nobility or orders of knights or other ranks of civilization, but really the whole of civilization was caught up in this kind of passionate desire to retake the Holy Land. It was at its heart a kind of holy war. The chief cheerleader for the Crusades were the several popes who, of course, reigned several times during that 200-year period. They made fantastic promises to people who would participate in the Crusades. Things like plenary forgiveness of sins, papal indulgences of the most magnanimous proportions, and eternal life and so on for people who would take up arms and engage in this crusading enterprise. There were also significant temporal benefits. People could go on a crusade and thereby exempt themselves from any indebtedness that they might have. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, you could probably talk me into that in a heartbeat. All your debts are gone if you just go on a crusade. And so those kinds of things also motivated people to participate in this. In other words, the point is it was a vast kind of sociological phenomenon that captured the imagination of the entire society, and that's part of what got so many people involved in it. We might, of course, from our perspective now in the beginning of the 21st century, wonder how could people square this highly militaristic disposition with anything resembling what we think of as a Christian message? How do you put that together? And all I can say to you is, it just wasn't that way in the Middle Ages. It was a gruesome, bloody time. Now, I'll tell you, it's not as bloody as the 20th century. We've lived in the bloodiest century of all, human history to date, apparently. But nevertheless, the kind of open and visible sword of brutality that was just more or less the name of the game for social experience seemed to make it much more tolerable or palatable, I would say, to engage in something like the Crusades at that time. A little bit more just as a preliminary here. Why did they happen? As I've done some reading and trying to think about this, I'm going to give you what is my opinion, not that I've done any more than just try to distill what I think are the contributions from much greater thinkers than I'll ever be, but I think we could reduce these to about 4 great causes, 4 great impulses that lie behind the Crusades. The first of which, and certainly the most famous, probably the most important, is simply what you call the Islamic thorn. I'm going to call it that, the Islamic threat, the Islamic grievance. We've already mentioned at other times in this class that Islam had really wrested the Holy Land from what had originally been the control of the Greek Christian culture, and that really by armed conflict had taken that real estate away. And there was, ever since that time, a kind of burning passion, a rising burning passion in the Christian soul in Europe to take that land back. This was considered an eminently, manifestly legitimate Christian objective because that was clearly Christian real estate. That was the idea. That's where Jesus lived. That's where he died. That's where the church was born. And all of those things just gave a kind of, almost intuitive sense that we should have that space, and it's been intruded upon by others who don't belong there. Added to that is the powerful preaching, especially of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, whose life we'll look at next week, and he's a remarkable fellow in many ways. But one of the things you have to say about him was he was a passionate advocate of the Crusades, and particularly the Second Crusade, as we'll see in a little bit. There were many others, many preachers, who just went through the land and especially were highlighting the fact that the regaining of the Holy Land was a legitimate Christian interest. So you have that. Now that's part of it. This is all under the rubric of the Islamic issue. Another part of the Islamic issue was that Islam had been just ravaging Christian people in the East. And there was a clear appeal coming from the Eastern Emperor and from the Patriarch in Constantinople, come and rescue us. That message was coming through loud and clear. Christian people were being slaughtered. In many cases, it was a ghastly thing that was arousing, again, a high degree of indignation on the part of European Christian thinkers and so on. And so that kind of added to this feeling of resentment, we'll say, against Islam. There was also the fact that Islam had been threatening the West. As late as 841, Rome and St. Peter's had been sacked at the hands of the Mohammedans in 846. Again, the threat was very real that Islam would come in, even as late as the 10th century, and John the VIII. I know you remember him because you were here last week. John the VIII, remember him? He was the 18-year-old who was the Pope, and he was threatened. In fact, when he first came to the papal throne, he was threatened, and that's what brought Otto across the mountains to rescue him. Of course, Otto deposed him the next year. You remember all that from last week. But nevertheless, that was pretty recent in the collective memory of Christian people that Islam had been right on the doorstep, you see, threatening not only the East but the West. And so all of that was giving rise to a high degree of motivation to put up some kind of defense and indeed a kind of counter-offense against Islam. And then finally, the other little piece of the Islamic puzzle here was that there had been for many years a common practice in Christendom of making pilgrimages to the holy sites. This was considered a legitimate Christian thing to do, to go and bathe in the Jordan River, and that sort of thing. And just as Christian people do today, love to go to the Holy Land and see all of these places. But what was happening was that as Christian pilgrims were going to Jerusalem and surrounding places, they were being antagonized, sometimes to the point of bloodshed, by, again, the Islamic occupiers of the land. And this was a mounting threat. In other words, in the 10th and 11th centuries in particular, it was becoming a very frightful thing to do. And people, when they went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, could almost view it as a kind of likely martyrdom. In other words, that was the kind of level of commitment it might take to do so. So the point is, all of this, the Islamic issue, certainly is the most famous, and I would say the fundamental motivating interest there, but not the only one. The other one, or another one I'd like to mention, the second of my four, is the basic idea that resided in the Christian soul of the legitimacy of a pilgrimage period. The Crusades were a kind of pilgrimage, and there had been pilgrimages going on in Christian history up until that time. Now, I want to say at this point, a pilgrimage is essentially an Old Testament idea, and certainly other religions know something of a pilgrimage. You'll find that in Islam and other religious systems. In the New Testament, you don't have any idea of a pilgrimage as such. But figures that come after the New Testament time did pick up that notion and kind of popularize it. The mother of Constantine did a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and greatly popularized the idea. Jerome did a pilgrimage, and so he and others gave a kind of impetus to the notion that lasted for many centuries into the future that Christians should go on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Now, I have to say there were many Christian thinkers who discouraged it. Augustine said a pilgrimage has no place in the New Testament church, that we don't have a, quote, holy site anymore. We don't have a central sanctuary as they had in the Old Covenant regime. And the whole philosophy that underlies the notion of a pilgrimage has been set aside. The woman at the well, when she talked to Jesus, asked the question, should we worship in this mountain or should we worship at Jerusalem? And Jesus says, neither one. You know, the days are coming when those who worship will worship in spirit and in truth. The days of pilgrimage are over, is the idea. But the church didn't quite learn that right off the bat. And so you have this ongoing desire and indeed belief that it is a legitimate and desirable and appropriate and indeed in some cases mandatory thing to do the pilgrimage. The rebuke to that, I believe, in the New Testament is the words of the angel to the women that came to the tomb. Why are you seeking the living among the dead? Now, I'm not saying here Christians shouldn't go to the Holy Land. Obviously, I think that's a wonderful thing to do, and so it's, but not to go in the mentality of the holy trip, the pilgrimage. That's, you see, where we need to be very cautious about how we view this. Jesus is not there. The living is not among the dead. He's not in the graveyards in Palestine anymore. He rose from the dead. He ascended to the heaven. He is reigning over the entire cosmos. And we no longer go to a, quote, holy place to somehow find a concentrated expression of the presence of God in some sense that it isn't, that God's presence wouldn't be found anywhere else. I'm kind of on a little bit of a soapbox on this, if you don't mind, just I'll extend my footnote just a bit, because we have in our present, especially American conservative Christianity, a very profound risk of getting back into the sort of armed pilgrimage mentality. This is part of a whole theology called dispensationalism. It's popularized in the Left Behind series and has been around for a while. I know I'm stepping on a couple of toes here, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because I've got the mic right at the moment. And it does create this notion of of doing the pilgrimage, you see. And it really, I think, gets the church perilously close to the same mentality that was occupying her imagination in the 11th and 12th centuries. I appreciated Father Shakur, who was here, 3 or 4 weeks ago. I think he really, at least in passing, addressed that very point, that it's causing more problems than doing good for those who are trying to bring peace to that troubled region. But in any event, I'll leave that little remark at that. The idea of the pilgrimage, in other words, was another kind of guiding force or driving force behind the Crusades. A third one was the increasing fascination and indeed superstitious obsession with relics. And so it was becoming increasingly fashionable to build one's faith around the acquisition of various alleged relics. All kinds of relics, pieces of the cross, and various other, things. This becomes really a big deal in the Reformation. But in fact, Calvin makes a passing remark that there were enough pieces of the cross in existence to sink a battleship, by the time of the Reformation. But anyway, of course, if you're going to find a relic, where else to go? You go to the place where all these things happened, and you dig up the stuff that allegedly was part of the holy story that's recorded for us in the New Testament. And finally, the last element I'll mention is just the spirit of the times. We really, in the Crusades, are reaching the apex of what you'd call the age of chivalry. And while chivalry means many wonderful things in the, lore and imagination and romantic recollection we have as Western people, nevertheless, there is a lot in chivalry of just the glory of warfare. The glory of going to battle for some noble cause. And that had really reached a kind of fevered pitch by the time of the Crusades, and the Pope was able to strike that like kindling with a match, and it just set Europe aflame with the hope and the desire of doing something that would fall within the parameters, really, of this chivalrous kind of hope. How did they get started? The idea of the Crusades had been floating around in the mind of Christian people and Christian leadership for some time. I alluded to this a little bit last week. But Sergius IV, who was the Pope, he died in 1012. Now, this is 1012. This is almost 100 years before the First Crusade. Made the comments concerning the Mohammedans, who he said, quote, had defiled Jerusalem and destroyed the church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he made those comments clearly suggesting that the time was coming when there should be a rectifying of those grievous crimes that had been committed. Even before him, Sylvester II, that I alluded to last week, he died in 1003, had urged that the time may be coming for an armed attack against those who had invaded and co-opted the holy precincts. Probably the most important pope to come along before the Crusades, who really built something of the philosophical platform for them, was Hildebrand. Again, we mentioned him last week, Gregory VII. He received in 1074 an appeal from Michael VII, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, pleading with him, pleading with the West, in spite of the fact that only 20 years earlier, East and West had split over the filial controversy. You remember that? And even though it was still fresh in their memories, here's the Patriarch of Constantinople pleading with Hildebrand, come and rescue us from the ravages that we're experiencing at the hands of the bloodthirsty Mohammedans. Many thousands of Eastern Christians had been killed. Savage, brutal kinds of treatment had happened. Hildebrand was incensed. He wanted to rise to the occasion, and so he did, in fact, plan a rescue mission. He mustered an army of about 50,000, pretty solid army, mostly well-trained military types. And this army was ready to go, and he was ready to give the order. And then because of some political reversals, that army never did leave. So the first crusade actually could have happened in 1074 under Hildebrand. It just didn't, as it turned out in the vagaries of history. But certainly the idea that such a thing could happen, should happen, was deeply implanted into the Christian consciousness through his efforts. Some years later, there was a strange, kind of mysterious and eccentric figure who began to show up in and around Europe, who went by the name Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit. He was a strange-looking guy, very gaunt, traveled on a kind of donkey, sort of one of these strange figures that seems a little surreal, but he would show up and preach passionately for a military expedition to the Holy Land. He was a monk of unknown origins. He had made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where he said he was confronted by the archbishop who was there, Simeon, urging him to carry the appeal to Europe to come and rescue the Holy Land from the ravages of Islam. He said he had a vision while he was there, sleeping within a stone's throw of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was in Jerusalem, in which Christ personally came to him and said he was the man to go and awaken Europe to the need for a military expedition to rescue the Holy Land. And so Peter heard all of this, went back to Europe, began preaching here and there, and had a powerful impact on the popular culture. He eventually actually reached the Pope at the time, whose name was Urban II. And Urban, who talked to Peter and other pilgrims coming back, reporting the dismal circumstances in the Holy Land, Urban II began to think, this is the time. This is the time when the crusade ought to happen. There was a council of the church that was convened in 1095. It's called the Council of Clermont. Urban II, who was French, attended the council. Clermont is in southern France. France was really the heart of chivalry at that time. The greatest champions of the chivalrous spirit really hearkened from France. And so on the 9th day of that council, Pope Urban II addressed a huge crowd, not only of leaders in the church, but a huge popular audience as well, all gathering to hear the Pope give this great announcement. And the entire sermon that he preached was a sermon calling for and rallying enthusiasm for a expedition, a military expedition to the Holy Land. He preached that the Turks had devastated the kingdom of God by fire, by pillage and sword. He said that Jerusalem laid waste. He said that Antioch was under the yoke and that Christ would now lead the charge under the banner of the cross to vindicate his name and to reclaim this holy real estate. This particular throng of people who heard him preach, of course, had a mingled philosophy and consciousness of adventure and a kind of credulous faith, you might say, and they were French. Urban was French. He was appealing to the French vitality. Charlemagne was the great ruler. He was French. His sons were French. You know, it was a very French kind of thing, if you get my drift here. And so this was the nature of the sermon, and it hit home big time. Philip Schaff says, quote, "The address was the most effective sermon ever preached by a pope or any other mortal. It stirred the deepest feelings of the hearers and was repeated throughout all Europe." And that's exactly what happened. This sermon was, as it were, you know, copied and just repreached and repreached here and there around the European world. During his sermon, the people began to rise in a kind of rally and chant, saying together, "God wills it, God wills it, God wills it." And Pope Urban joined into it with these words, quote, "It is the will of God. Let these words be your war cry. When you unsheathe the sword, you are soldiers of the cross. Wear it on your breasts or shoulders, the blood-red sign of the cross. Wear it as a token that his help will never fail you, as a pledge of a vow never to be recalled." A very stirring, inspiring sermon with a known enemy and a known evil to be countered in the name of the cross. And I think you can sense how you could get a kind of rallying to that particular appeal. Well, thousands that day did take the vow, vowed to go on a holy crusade to the Holy Land. They sewed on their garments emblems of the cross. Some of them stripped off their clothes and had actually branded literally on their skin the sign of the cross as a mark of their having submitted themselves to a vow to do so. A whole bunch of fiery preachers were commissioned to spread the word around the European world, chief of whom was Peter the Hermit, but many others went around preaching this as well. And so over the next several months, 9 or 10 months, a huge army was assembled. They all were looking forward to the year 1096 when this first military expedition would take place. Again, Schaff talks about what a kind of paradigm shift this was in European history, and it really is not to be understated how much this began to change the whole culture of Europe in ways that it's never gone back. And he puts it in these words, quote, "A new era in European history was begun. A new passion had taken hold of its people. A new arena of conquest was opened for the warlike feudal lord, a tempting field of adventure and release for knight and debtor, an opportunity of freedom for serf and villein. All classes, lay and clerical, saw in the expedition to the cradle of their faith a solace for sin, a satisfaction of Christian fancy, a heaven-appointed mission. The struggle of states with the papacy was for a minute at an end. All Europe was suddenly united in a common and holy cause, of which the supreme pontiff was beyond dispute the appointed leader." Well, all of these people began to assemble the following year, and essentially the official date for the First Crusade was August 15th, 1096. A huge group of people assembled, the first of whom you would look at them and you just shake your head in wonder, because it was a completely motley crew, you know, as they say. I mean, it was a lot of women and children and people coming from here and there, and not people necessarily trained at all in the arts of warfare. And while you did have some military types who showed up, many of these people were hardly equipped for this particular venture. One eyewitness put it in these words, quote, "The Welshman left his hunting, the Scot his fellowship with lice, the Dane his drinking party, the Norwegian his raw fish. Fields were deserted of their husbandmen, whole cities migrated. God alone was placed before their eyes." And that's kind of the picture you have, just a huge gathering of people. The First Crusade was preceded by, this is considered part of the First Crusade, but it isn't really properly so. The First Crusade was preceded by several, I'll simply call them swarms. Not really expeditions. That's too good a word for it. But you have about 4 swarms. The first of these, in fact all of these were led by rather enthusiastic but utterly incompetent leaders. The first one was about 20,000 people led by William the Penniless. That was his name. So he led these 20,000 people. They marched in great, spiritual enthusiasm until they got to Belgrade, and they were just demolished. They were just essentially annihilated at that point. Very few of them actually straggled into Constantinople. The second swarm was led by Peter the Hermit himself. This was about 40,000. They did have a few knights at their disposal. However, when they reached the outskirts of Bulgaria, a well-armed army there just annihilated them. They were basically destroyed. About 7,000 of them survived and reached Constantinople, at which time they were transported to Asia Minor, arrived in Nicaea, and suffered a huge, again, ghastly defeat, so that there's a record of a huge pile of bones of these people that were in a great pyramid that were burned, these first swarm of crusaders, utterly, utterly defeated. Walter the Pitiless, died in that particular conflagration. And even Peter the Hermit had to escape by the skin of his teeth back to Constantinople, suffering a bit of a loss of his reputation at that point. The third swarm was about 15,000 people under a German monk whose name was Gottschalk. They were basically massacred by the Hungarians. The fourth swarm was over 100,000 people, if reports are correct, led by a guy whose name was Emich of Leiningen. They began in May 1096 their progression along the Rhine River, one of the most tragic stories. They just annihilated, especially Jewish people, in a great slaughter along the Rhine on their way to the Holy Land. However, when they reached Hungary, they were completely destroyed. So this was, again, completely unsuccessful and really misguided effort. Some of this really is the first crusade, properly speaking, was sort of the first initial enthusiastic effort that was utterly unsuccessful. The actual first crusading army was around 300,000. They traveled to the Holy Land in several companies. They met at Constantinople. From there, traveled to Nicaea. This was populated by a pretty goodly number of competent military types. They were led by, or at least one of their leaders was Robert of Normandy, who was actually the son of William the Conqueror, who you recall was important for the conquest of England. These were really the richest, brightest, and best of the European nobility, and they took up arms and had some idea how to use them. The moral hero, really, of the group was Godfrey of Boulogne. He was actually a lineal descendant of Charlemagne, a man of legendary strength and physical power, and so he was really the one that kind of rallied them to the task at hand. They took Nicaea in 1097. A year later, they laid siege to and took the city of Antioch, but they suffered great losses in the process. Their ranks were really wiped out by famine. Even Peter the Hermit tried to desert at that point. However, their energies were somewhat revived by the discovery of the alleged lance that had stabbed Jesus when he hung on the cross. And they took that as a great omen that now is the time to go and vindicate the Savior. So they did succeed in taking Antioch and pressed on from there to Jerusalem. They came inside of Jerusalem on July 15th, 1099. There are stories of the Crusaders when they spotted the holy city falling on their knees, kissing the earth, and otherwise engaging in the most spectacular displays of religious devotion now that they were within sight of their ultimate goal. They were held at bay for about 5 days. The defenders of the city using all of the standard medieval tactics, boiling oil, catapulted boulders and bows and arrows and that kind of thing. In fact, there is a story that the Crusaders actually marched around the outside of Jerusalem, hoping maybe the walls would cave in, as they had done in the case of Jericho and Joshua's, but it didn't quite work out that way. So finally, on the Friday of that week, reinforced by outside military help, they finally stormed the city. There are legendary stories of great visions and so on that came to the people to encourage them in this quest. But in any event, they did successfully invade the city. It's an ugly sight. There was great carnage within the city, great bloodshed, gratuitous destruction of human life, and so on. Many Jewish people residing in Jerusalem were burned in their synagogues. One of the great black eyes, of course, of all Christian history is just the vicious treatment that was meted out to Jewish people on occasion, and certainly this qualifies as one of them. In any event, Jerusalem was taken. The Crusaders established there then a kind of outpost And this became what was called the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. And for almost 100 years, the West controlled Jerusalem and its environs. And there was actually a king who was appointed, and Jerusalem was under the control of the Western Empire and the Western Church all during that period of time. For the first half of that period, Jerusalem was under some degree of competent rule. And then there was a gradual deterioration. Under Baldwin, as he was named, who ruled in Jerusalem 1100 to 1118, the expanse of the territory controlled by the Crusaders was expanded quite a bit. Castles were put up. Some of you visited the Holy Land and have actually visited probably some of the castles, the ruins of those castles that were erected there by the Crusaders. This is kind of one of those strange anomalies that you've got castles built according to kind of European standards right there in the Holy Land. Well, they were put up by the Crusaders, and obviously they were planning to stay for a while, hence these structures. As time went on, however, the quality of the leadership, the kings in Jerusalem gradually deteriorated, and the entire defensibility of Jerusalem became more and more in question. I'm skipping over for a moment the Second Crusade. It took place during that time frame of the Latin Kingdom in Jerusalem. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I'd like to just finish the story of what happened in Jerusalem. Gradually, Islam was able to consolidate its forces. There had been a great split in Islam at the beginning, and that's part of why the Crusaders were successful. But under a legendary military figure whose name was Saladin, who was a great Islamic general, they were able to put together a great army to come back and retake Jerusalem. And in fact, in 1187, on October 2nd, virtually without a shot being fired, Saladin came back into the city of Jerusalem, retook the city. I have to say, in all honesty, he treated the Christian occupants of that city vastly more humanely than the Christians had treated the infidels 100 years earlier when they had taken the city in the first instance. He did not engage in the scenes of butchery that had otherwise been part of the original taking of Jerusalem. He gave the inhabitants the freedom to leave if they wished upon payment of an appropriate price. And so there was quite a bit of money that flowed into the coffers, but he freed them to leave. And that really brought to an end the so-called Latin Kingdom in Jerusalem. Now, during that tenure, that period of time from 1099 up to about 1187, the Second Crusade occurred. The Second Crusade was triggered by the fall of one of the outposts that had been established in this so-called Latin Kingdom, a little place called Edessa. And the Pope at the time, Eugenius III, saw that as maybe the fracture in the wall that needed to be defended, and so he rallied an army to respond to that. The man that he tapped to go out and preach and popularize the Second Crusade was Bernard. And next week I want to look separately at the life of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, a remarkable man. We might, raise our eyebrows and wonder that he was such a principal player in the Second Crusade, and I'm not going to rise to his defense in that regard, but I also don't want to just discount his entire life based on that one point, because he otherwise does represent a great figure in church history that I think we should be aware of. But in any event, there were two great converts under the preaching of Bernard. One was Louis VII of France, and the other was Conrad III, who was the emperor. And these two responded to Bernard's preaching and were willing to become participants in this great crusade, and they set out in that regard. Conrad had very little success. In fact, he actually died on the expedition itself. He drowned while bathing, and so it was a rather unfortunate and unexpected death of the emperor at that point, which pretty much demoralized his army. And the other one, Louis, was able to arrive with an intact army. These two met the king in Jerusalem, Baldwin III. They did an expedition against Damascus that was utterly a failure. They not only didn't take Damascus, they didn't even reach Edessa, which was the reason that they were going. The whole thing was a dismal collapse, and they all kind of went home tails between their legs. Bernard himself viewed the entire fiasco as a judgment by God not so much on the notion of a crusade in principle, but on the ungodly attitudes that were possessing these people as they attempted to accomplish the crusade. The third crusade is probably the most famous and probably the only one I'll have time to really give you any detail on. The third crusade comes immediately after Jerusalem fell back into the hands of the Mohammedans. Urban III, who was the pope at the time, died of grief, as it said, of news of that. The European princes of that day laid aside their differences and decided the time had come once again to rally the forces to go and retake Jerusalem. So the Third Crusade had that particular objective in mind. This brought together the greatest figures the most powerful figures of European life at that time. The emperor, who was Frederick Barbarossa, Philip Augustus, who was king of France, and of course King Richard I, otherwise known as King Richard the Lionhearted, were the three figures that rallied to the task here. Probably this is the highest moment of what we call chivalry. This was the moment when whatever that is achieved its very apex and was expressed in many ways in the legendary meeting of the two greatest soldiers in the world of that day, Richard I, the Lionhearted, and Saladin. This is, by the way, celebrated, if you want to read this, in a wonderful historical novel that kind of gets you into the spirit of the age. Sir Walter Scott's book, Talisman, is the account of this, and it's fascinating reading, so you might want to put that on your reading list for some time if you want to go into that in greater detail. But in any event, these three forces brought their armies together. They traveled to the Holy Land. They had some success. They did take one little outpost city that was called Acre, or Acre, either way, which became a kind of base of operation for several of the succeeding crusades. They then advanced on Jerusalem. They were not successful in their attempts to take Jerusalem, not so much because they lacked the military clout, but because they lacked the internal order. There was a lot of disunion, a lot of antagonism, and that disunity was finally their undoing. Nevertheless, Richard himself distinguished himself as practically a legendary figure. He was big, and he was a man of some amazing military competence, and there's stories of him going out in front of the whole army on the other side, all by himself on a horse, challenging anybody to come against him, and nobody dared. He was such an awesome figure. But for all of that, they didn't have much to show for their efforts, and Richard himself had to return to England because of the shenanigans of his brother John, who was, of course, trying to take the throne of England in the absence of Richard. So you've got all that little bit of European history playing there as well. One other little story before we wrap this up. There were actually 7 crusades. One of them, that's not counted among the 7, probably the most tragic of all, is the so-called Children's Crusade. There were actually several of these. They were rallying around 2 children, one in France, one in Germany. In France, there was a young fellow, 12 years old. His name was Stephen, who was able to actually gather some 30,000 children to follow him on a very misguided hope to do a crusade. They were hoping the sea would part before them at Marseille. It didn't. And these children, it was just a tragic situation. Many of them died on the journey. Many were sold into slavery. Many others were just simply lost, never heard from again. Similarly, there was a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas in Germany who again rallied a great gathering to follow him. Surprisingly, many adults were on these children's crusades. They believed these kids had these visions and that this was somehow, God speaking to them and calling them forth. Interestingly, you would think that the abysmal circumstances of the loss of life and so on with the children's crusades would have caused the adults to wake up and realize this might not be an appropriate venture for us all to be involved in, but actually the net effect of it was to kind of shame the adults into trying again. If the children will do this, then how come we adults are sitting home doing nothing kind of deal, you see? So it actually in many ways did foster further crusading efforts as well. I'm not going to give you detail on the others. Suffice it to say, none of the crusades succeeded. One of them did achieve a kind of political compromise with Islam to allow pilgrimages to proceed once again, and made some gains more or less on diplomatic terms rather than by any kind of military strategy. But aside from the First Crusade and the winning of Jerusalem for a period of time, you would say militarily they were all just appallingly unsuccessful. And they certainly, I think, taught the church a lesson, I hope, as we look back on it and ask, what do we learn from this? That while it's certainly a legitimate thing for Christian people to be preaching the gospel, it is probably not a legitimate thing for us to be preaching the gospel at the point of a sword or otherwise thinking that we can simply beat into submission the pagan, or otherwise impose by force the sweet gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. A couple of concluding remarks here before we wrap this up. The Crusades, I think, on balance, you would say, were an abysmal failure. The objectives of the Crusades, none of them were met. The Holy Land was not regained. From the time of the Crusades on, the Holy Land was under the control of Islam. It has been that case right up to the 20th century. Within our own lifetime, we know some of the events that have changed that, but that's all been very recent history. Certainly, Islam was not permanently checked, which was another ambition of the Crusades. The schism between East and West was not healed. That was part of what Hildebrand was hoping. The Fourth Crusade was an abominable looting and destroying of Constantinople, of all things. And in this completely outrageous and misguided effort, there was a kind of a blasphemous sacrilege of some of the most holy places of Eastern Christian religion there in Constantinople. And that really nailed the coffin shut forever as to any hope of bringing East and West back together. The doctrine of papal indulgences was really born out of the Crusades under Pope Urban II. And of course, if you know the Reformation, you know that was one of the chief events that led up to the reaction of Martin Luther at the time of the Reformation. Did anything good come out of the Crusades? I think so. And so I'd like to leave us at least on a somewhat happier note. While I'm going to say on balance, it was bad news, there's still a little bit of good I think we can derive from it. And so if you'll permit me, let me suggest these. One thing that actually even Gibbon, who's no friend of Christianity, remarks concerning the Crusades is that it did engage minds in something bigger and nobler than their own little lives. He says, quote, "The controlling emotion with most of the Crusaders was, beyond question, a lofty ideal of enthusiasm." And that was certainly there. It was misguided, to be sure. We would say the method that they were using was infinitely off base, but that there was some desire to do a noble thing was certainly present. And so, being at least giving as much benefit of the doubt as we can, I think we'd have to acknowledge that. From a Protestant point of view, one of the very positive effects of the Crusades was it served to greatly undermine the power of the hierarchy of the church. It's been argued that the Protestant Reformation would not have been nearly as likely to have happened had it not been for the Crusades. It actually set people's minds on the thought that the Pope might be wrong, of all things, you see. And the Crusades kind of stood out as Exhibit A of that proposition. And so that, and again, at least from a Protestant point of view, if you're a Catholic here this morning, you may disagree with me as to whether that was a positive or negative development, but nevertheless, it certainly was an effect. The Crusades served to profoundly undermine and ultimately destroy old feudalism. Old feudalism was a caste system in society in which there were a few at the top and the vast majority lived in a kind of quasi-slavery, working the land. And the Crusades really did have the effect of changing the whole socio-economic climate of Europe. This was the time when the nation-states began to rise, and really through the commercial effects of the Crusades, a middle class began to appear in European civilization, which had theretofore been non-existent. And that, again, became a very important contributing factor at the later time of the Reformation. The Crusades had the effect of spreading education because it created a great interaction in which now the whole world was bigger. This contact with the East And the influences that passed back and forth had a vast effect along those lines. And finally, it just gave a great stimulus to commerce. Even though the Crusades themselves were a warring expedition, one of the side effects of that was just to open commerce to the east. And all of a sudden, export and import trade and so on took place, and people eventually began to lay down arms and just, dicker over the price of whatever the commodity was there. And that in itself did tend to create a great deal of wealth that never would have been created otherwise. So while the method certainly is dubious, we could still say that there were some positive effects that came out of it. And frankly, that's the best I can do on the Crusades. It's a tough story, but hopefully that gives us a little bit of thought on that. Questions, please, John. Oh boy, what a question. John always asks, I don't know why I even call on you, John, because you always ask these questions. Now, does the church look at the Crusades? Is that something that was part of God's plan, or rather is something that we sweep under the carpet? And I guess I'd want to rule out both of those. It's certainly part of the story. But the story of the church is always a mixture of the good with the evil. It always is. Whether microcosmically in any individual church or in the great picture of what happens in the sweep of the ages, I think it's one of the great arguments for God's grace and sovereignty that he can actually accomplish his purposes in spite of us. And as misguided and ill-advised as some of our tactics may be, he still succeeds in building his kingdom and accomplishing his purposes in the big picture. I want to take the Crusades and just make them part of the story. I don't want to sweep them under the carpet because there's too much we need to learn from them, lest we, do the same thing again, which we certainly are capable of doing. On the other hand, I don't think any thoughtful Christian would want to embrace them and say, this represents God's best way, to accomplish his purposes. At least the evidence certainly wouldn't seem to suggest that. So, any other comments or questions? Yes, please. Yeah, John's question is from the point of view of Islam. How were they interpreting the Crusades? That's a question that requires considerably, more time than I can give it in the next 30 seconds. Islam was at its very core, always has been a militaristic religion. There is only one kind of classical Islam, and that's militaristic Islam. And so they viewed this as just, business as usual, that they have to fight and carry on that kind of warfare. So I don't think there was philosophically much problem from Islam's point of view facing the fact that the great Satan was after them and they had to, take up arms and resist. Christians had a vastly more complex ethic to wrestle with, I would say, in that regard than did Islam.